I'm standing here in the Platz on Kaisersteg in Schöneweide in Berlin. In the 19th century, this was one of the industrial centers of Berlin, and therefore part of its economic power. And you can see around me here a crane that extended down to the river, to the Spree, to offload coal and wood and stuff like that that it needed and unload products. This was the electricity production center for Berlin, and they made transformers and cables and light bulbs and things like that. During the war, the Nazis, of course, took it over and they made weapons here. And then when the Soviets came in after the war, they took it over and it became part of East Germany. It then fell into ruin after the wall came down. And now they're building, as happens with capitalism, right, in the ruins, then they come in and they build expensive ateliers and student housing and cafes and stuff like that. Capitalism always keeps the commodity production and commodity sales going. And I think this place here with its economic history and economic struggle and class struggle is a great place for me to read from my book on how Marx used Shakespeare to discuss and to anchor the concepts in his economic critique, his critique of capitalism. And so I'm going to begin reading here, starting with Marx actually saying that it's Shakespeare who understands this. Here's Marx. Shakespeare excellently depicts the real nature of money. To understand him, let us first begin with a passage from Goethe. That which is for me through the medium of money, that for which I can pay, i.e., which money can buy, that I am myself, the possessor of money. The extent of the power of money is the extent of my power. Money's properties are the possessor's properties and essential powers. Thus what I am and am capable of is by no means determined by my individuality. I am ugly, but I can buy for myself the most beautiful of women. Therefore, I am not ugly, for the effect of ugliness, its deterrent power, is nullified by money. I, according to my individual characteristics, am lame, but money furnishes me with 24 feet. Does not my money, therefore, transform all my incapacities into their contrary? End quote. And it's this sense of inversions that Marx is taking from Shakespeare, and indeed from world literature writers going all the way back to Homer, who have complained about how money, gold, exchange value, inverts everything in life. And now I write. These lines from Faust are spoken by Mephistopheles when he is closing the deal for Faust's soul. There are two conceits in these lines that are useful for Marx. First, money makes the impossible possible. And he takes that also not just from Goethe, but later from Shakespeare. It is the procurer and transformer of all. Second, it appears that in the money economy, the capacities to do all of this lie in money itself. And that is Marx's great discovery, which is commodity fetishism, that we think that it's money that has the power. The man in Mephistopheles' example tears along using the strength of the 6 stallions he has purchased, as if that strength were the strength of his own legs. In this same manner, Mephistopheles is offering Faust the strength of the devil for the price of Faust's soul. In Marx's passage above, he says that he is lame in his individual characteristics, but that money has furnished him with 24 feet, an allusion to Mephistopheles' promise of 6 stallions. However, the real horsepower of wealth is the productive capacities of the workers. Once the capitalist purchases the workers' labor power, this power appears as the capitalist's power and obscures its true origin. Marx then quotes one of world literature's most sustained inversion conceits, Shakespeare's late play, Timon of Athens, co-authored with Thomas Middleton. And I'll now splice into this video a reading I did from Timon of Athens in an ex-DDR brewery. I'm standing in the ruins of an ex-East German brewery, a state-owned company, a socialist enterprise. And here I want to talk about the nexus between William Shakespeare and Karl Marx on the question of money. And now money has been around for centuries, for a very, very long time. And it serves as an exchange value between a product and people's needs. If you're hungry in a money economy, you can get food if you can buy it. If you're cold in a money economy, you can get a jacket if you can buy it. Now, people throughout these centuries have said that this is inhumane. And Karl Marx is probably one of the most famous critics of the money-based economy. The system that he was critiquing is called capitalism. And in capitalism, money has come to be capital, that is finance capital. And finance capital doesn't just stand between our needs and the products. Finance capital creates an entire society, an entire world. It controls production, distribution, culture. It even controls, in a way, the way we think. And Karl Marx critiqued this in his most famous book, Das Kapital, or Capital. In my book, Shakespeare's Influence on Karl Marx, one of the things that I talk about is how Marx's critique of capitalism was partly sourced from his reading of Shakespeare. And he says this, Marx says that Shakespeare understood the money economy better than the political economists. But Shakespeare didn't write a warning about money. He put that warning in the words of some of his characters. For example, the bastard in King John, talking about the tickling commodity. Or, more famously, Timon of Athens. And Timon is a wealthy Athenian. And he was a philanthropist. He gives a lot of money to people. But then he ran out of money, and he said he needed some of that back so he could pay his bills. And the people he gave money to, his supposed friends, didn't offer him any money back. And he realized, well, they were just greedy. They were taking advantage of him. So he becomes very upset, and he flips into becoming a misanthropist. And he leaves Athens, he goes out into the woods, removes everything, including his clothing, and in some productions spends the whole second half of the play naked on stage. And at one point, Timon is digging for edible roots. And what does he find but gold, a hoard of gold under the ground? And he lifts up the gold and he speaks these lines. These lines are quoted by Karl Marx in almost all of his economic books. This is what Timon says, written by Shakespeare. What is here? Gold, yellow, glittering, precious gold. No, gods, I am no idle votarist. Roots, you clear heavens. Thus much of this will make black, white, foul, fair, wrong, right, base, noble, old, young, coward, valiant. Ha! You gods, why this? What this, you gods? Why this will lug your priests and servants from your sides, pluck stout men's pillows from below their heads. This yellow slave will knit and break religions, bless the accursed, make the horrid leprosy adored, place thieves and give them title, knee, and approbation, with senators on the bench. This is it that makes the wappered widow wed again, she whom the spittle house and ulcerous sores would cast gorge at. This embalms and spices to the April day again. Come, damned earth, this common whore of mankind that puts odds among the rout of nations, I will make thee do thy right nature. A little bit later in the play, he says again about money. O thou sweet king killer, and dear divorce twixt natural son and sire, thou bright defiler of Hymen's purest bed, thou valiant Mars, thou ever young, fresh, loved, and delicate wooer, whose blush doth thaw the consecrated snow that lies on Dian's lap, thou visible God, that solderest close impossibilities, and makes them kiss, that speakest with every tongue to every purpose, O thou touch of hearts, think thy slave man rebels, and by thy virtue set them into confounding odds, that beasts may have the world in empire. I'm here in Stralau, Berlin, which is a peninsula that splits the Spree River from the Rummelsburg Sea. And Karl Marx was sent here in 1837 to rest. He had been studying at the University of Berlin, and he was studying so much that basically he gave himself a nervous breakdown. So his doctor sent him out here to rest, but instead of resting, he brought with him Hegel's Science of Logic and began to read it. And in a famous letter to his father, Marx talks about what happens here. And the East German government made a monument here. You can see behind me there's a monument still, a little park, to Karl Marx and to this time and his development here in Stralau. Stralau used to be a fishing village. It was also a place where people from Berlin could come down and hang out and have a little day out. But what I'm going to do is I want to read from my book about this time and what Marx was doing and what he was writing to his father. So this is the beginning of my second chapter, which is titled, "But Where Then?" That is the question. And it was a question that his father asked him, "Where are you?" He says, "I can't even find you. I don't even have your address in Berlin." And of course the question is loaded because Marx his ideology, his thinking, his philosophy was changing quite a bit. One day in May 1837, 19-year-old Karl Marx walked from his student flat in Berlin, the Prussian capital where he had been sent by his father for university studies, along Stralauer Strasse, towards the eastern gate of the city. He was on his way to the tiny fishing village of Stralau, and that's here, having been prescribed a period of rest there by a doctor after a demanding first term at university, during which he studied day and night and became ill due to exhaustion. On the way, he passed the Holzmarkt, where the wood that powered Berlin, a commodity he would later write about in his journalism, was offloaded and stored. He stepped through the customs border at Stralauer Tor, the line that protected the newly hegemonic economy of the Prussian capital. At last he was in the countryside, walking along a tree-lined road through the Friedrichshain below Boxhagen or Colony, an area that would become an industrial center when Prussia began to catch up with other modernizing European nations. In a letter to his father written on 10th of November 1837, Marx recounts his condition during the journey. Thus, by these various occupations the first semester, through staying awake many nights, fighting through many battles, having to endure many internal and external stimulations, that I at the end emerged still not very enriched, and thereby neglected nature, art, and world, had rejected friends, this reflection appeared to be made by my body. A doctor recommended the countryside for me, and so advised, I traversed the length of the city for the first time, came to the Stralauer Gate. I did not foresee that I would mature there from an anemic weakling to a robust strength of body. So the strength that he would develop in his body is only a part of this. It's the strength that he would develop in his mind that's key here. The young Marx metamorphosis from weakness to robustness was wrought by his discovery of the central device of philosophy taught at his university, Hegel's dialectic. Marx took lectures from Edward Gons, Hegel's successor at Berlin. In the first semester, he found the fragments of Hegel's philosophy, he read the fragments of Hegel's philosophy, which he found unpleasing, but then when he arrived in Stralau, where he was sent to rest from his studies, he plunged deeply into Hegel's works. Marx writes to his father, "During my unwellness, I learned Hegel from beginning to end, together with, and became acquainted with most of his students. Through a number of get-togethers with friends in Stralau, I got into a doctor's club, led by some lecturers and my most intimate Berlin friend, Dr. Rutenberg. Here, in controversy, many conflicting views were revealed, and I became ever more firmly chained to the present world philosophy, which I had thought to escape. But all richness of sound was silenced, and I was seized with a real fury of irony, as could easily happen after so many negations. In addition, there came Jenny's silence," so his girlfriend was back home in Trier, his fiancée was back home in Trier, "and I could not rest until I won modernity and the point of the modern world of science." And here science, he means Wissenschaft as in philosophy. In a letter to his father, Marx describes the moment the metamorphosis occurred. He had been working through Hegel's logic and had tasked himself with integrating art and knowledge and, quote, a philosophical dialectical development of divinity as it manifests itself as the notion in itself, as religion, as nature, as history. Then he writes, this work, my dearest child, nurtured by moonlight, bore me like a false siren into the arms of the enemy. From vexation, I could not think for a couple of days. I ran around as if I were crazy in the garden by the dirty water of the Spree, which, quote, washes souls and dilutes tea. Even participated in a hunting excursion with my host and raced back to Berlin and wanted to hug every street loafer. And then I write, this child nurtured by moonlight was Marx's first attempt at writing dialectics. Performed correctly, as Hegel mandates in his Science of Logic, this dialectical course of the logic moves by its own progression, which is advanced through resolving the contradictions immanent in each step. It is not a philosophy that one forces. Instead, one lets the logic unfold. As such, it is a philosophy that has the power to carry one in its current. The moment that dialectic seized control of Marx's mind, it temporarily disrupted his capacity to think. His body took over, running circles in the guest house garden, which stood directly on the banks of the Spree. And that's here where I'm sitting. That's where that guest house was. At this point in its course, the river gains a particular turbulence as it flows around the Stralau Peninsula, half of it circulating into the Rummelburger Sea on the other side of Stralau. To register his condition, Marx reaches for a quotation from Heinrich Heine's poem. And this is where he says that the Spree washes souls and dilutes tea. And I go into an analysis of what that is in my book. In 1848, the nascent working class of Europe rose up alongside the Democrats and the Nationalists. The workers were already standing in opposition to the capitalist system, which was still in the process of constituting itself in Europe. The Democrats fought for rights and freedom from the absolutist state. The revolution was fought bravely, but in the end, it did not achieve its ends. Prussia, and especially France, became even more oppressive as they carried out their counter-revolution. At the start of the revolution, Marx was in exile in Brussels. He had just written the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels. They were both thrown out of Belgium and moved quietly to Cologne to open up a newspaper, the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. As the counter-revolution set in, warrants were written for their arrest and they had to flee. Engels fought in the last battles of the revolution, and Marx went to Paris and then to London, where he would spend the rest of his life. I'm standing in the cemetery and monument of those fallen in the March Revolution here in Berlin. And I want to read from the part in my book where I describe how Marx used characters from Shakespeare in his analysis of the 1848 revolution, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. There are at least 3 narrative threads running through Marx's writing in the 18th Brumaire. The first is what can be understood to be a set of instructions for revolutionary methodology. Revolutionaries should strip their consciousness of past superstition and dump the baggage they carry. This is accomplished through constant self-critique and self-analysis. The second tendency is the reality as it is turning out in Europe. The 1789 French Revolution turned itself into Napoleon's First Empire, a tragedy. The 1848 French Revolution underwent 3 periods. The first period, from the overthrow of Louis Philippe on 24 February 1848 to the meeting of the Constituent Assembly on May 4th, Marx calls the prologue of the revolution. The character of governing was provisional. The monarchy had run away, and a republic was proposed. The second period, from the 4th of May to the end of May 1849, was the period in which the bourgeois republic was constituted. During this period, the workers rose up against the bourgeoisie in order to retain some features of their revolutionary demands. They were slaughtered by the French National Guard, led by Cavaignac in the bloody June Days uprising. On the 10th of December 1848, the people of France enjoying universal suffrage, male suffrage for the first time, and with rural voting population greatly outnumbering the Parisian radicals, elected Louis Bonaparte to be their president. Marx calls him the hero Krapulinski, a figure of ridicule in Heinrich Heine's poem Zwei Ritter. During this period, Bonaparte prepared the way for the overthrow of the Republic, which he accomplished with the help of the lumpen proletariat, an exceedingly deluded population on 2 December 1851, when he dismissed the National Assembly and staged an auto coup d'etat, not the last one to occur in French history, by the way, and declared himself the emperor of the Second French Empire. Marx compared the Constitution to Achilles. It had a weak spot that could easily be exploited. Marx writes a deep allusion to Richard III. He says, on June 14th, a proclamation could be read on the walls of Paris in which the president, reluctantly, against his will, as it were, compelled by the sheer force of events, comes forth from his cloistered seclusion and posing as misunderstood virtue, complains of the calumnies of his opponents, and while he seems to identify his person with the cause of order, rather identifies the cause of order with his person. Marx is alluding to the scene in Richard III, where Richard is said to be staying, quote, within the two right reverend fathers, divinely bent to meditation, and in no worldly suits would he be moved, to draw him from his holy exercise. In another article, Marx quoted from the scene where Buckingham advises Richard to stand between two churchmen. Both Richard and Bonaparte perform the part of the reluctant ruler as a trick of their tyranny. Marx then describes the proletariat as vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, and so on and so forth. Then Marx writes, in his Society of December 10th, Bonaparte assembles 10,000 rascally fellows who are to play the part of the people as Nick Bottom that of the lion. And what he's alluding to here is in Act 1, Scene 2 of A Midsummer Night's Dream, where the mechanicals assemble and Peter Quince calls out the cast list. Nick Bottom is set to play one of the leads, Pyramus. When Quince calls out the part of the lion to be played by Snug the Joiner, Bottom yells out, "Let me play the lion too. I will roar that I will do any man's heart to hear me. Any man's heart good to hear me. I will roar that I will make him roar again. Let him roar again." In Marx's illusion, the joke is that the mercenary lumpen proletariat supporters of Bonaparte are not the correct actor to play the people in the revolution. As Marx moves through his analysis of the 1848 revolution and counter-revolution, he maintains a view that sweeps back and forth across history. His analysis has both a temporality and a depth. Marx writes, on the threshold of the February Revolution, the social republic appears as a phrase, as a prophecy. In the June days of 1848, it was drowned in the blood of the Paris proletariat, but it haunts the subsequent acts of the drama like a ghost. And what he's referring to here, he's alluding to the ghost in Hamlet. Marx writes, but the revolution is thoroughgoing. It is still journeying through purgatory. It does its work methodically. By December 2, 1851, it had completed one half of its preparatory work and is now completing the other half. First, it perfected parliamentary power in order to be able to overthrow it. Now that it has attained this, it perfects the executive power, reduces it to its purest expression, isolates it, sets it up against itself as the sole target in order to concentrate all of its forces of destruction against it. And when it has done this, the second half of its preliminary work, Europe will leap from its seat, exultingly exclaim, "Well burrowed, old mole." And this old mole allusion, which is to the ghost in Hamlet, Marx is going to use throughout his work. Later in another paper, Marx writes, in a sign that bewilders the middle class, the aristocracy, and the poor prophets of regression, we do recognize our brave friend Robin Goodfellow, the old mole that can work in the earth so fast, that worthy pioneer, the revolution. The ghost of Hamlet is once again working in Marx's illusion. His job is now clearly to be the revolution. However, Marx has added Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream to the image. He seems to have fused the ghost and Robin Goodfellow into one character. If the ghost represents class consciousness that cannot be kept suppressed, then it can stand for historical materialism. If Robin Goodfellow is the change agent of his play, the master of inversion, then he can stand for dialectics. Together, the ghost-Puck fusion can be understood to represent Marx's method of thinking, writing, and working for the revolution, a method that has come to be called dialectical materialism or Marxism. So I'm standing here next to the Heinrich Heine Denkmal in the Berlin Mitte next to the University of Berlin. This is Humboldt University behind me, and this is the statue to Heinrich Heine. Heine, one of the most important German writers, and he was a huge influence on Karl Marx. Heine was also a great Shakespearean. He read Shakespeare, wrote about Shakespeare, and used him in his works, weaved Shakespeare's lines into his works. And I guess we could say that he's also one of the people that taught or kind of mentored through his work Karl Marx about how to read Shakespeare. So I'm going to talk a little bit, I want to read a little bit from my book about Marx and Heine in Paris. Heine had been living in exile in Paris since 1831. He tried unsuccessfully to contact Marx in November 1842 when Marx was the editor at the Rheinische Zeitung. On 21 October 1843, Heine traveled back into Germany to visit his family and his publisher and to gather content for his next book. He returned to Paris in late December and was finally introduced to Karl and Jenny by Arnold Ruge. During that time that he spent close to them, he wrote the epic poem Deutschland ein Wintermärchen. It is likely that he edited it partly at Marx's flat. Indeed, Heine gifted Marx the proofs to Deutschland ein Wintermärchen. Marx's daughter Eleanor reports the following. There was a time, this is Eleanor Marx, there was a time where Heine day out and day in visited the Marxists and read them his verses and obtained the judgment of the two young people. Heine and Marx together could go through a small 8-line poem countless times, constantly discussing one word or another, and worked and filed away so long until everything was smooth and every trace of work and filing was removed. If so, then it may partly account for why Deutschland ein Wintermärchen is one of Heinrich Heine's most radical texts. For it contains not only Heine's characteristic attacks on the outdated and authoritarian German state and society, but it also contains a powerful critique of the capitalist future in Germany and a statement of the role of poets to resist it. Deutschland ein Wintermärchen announces in its title an intertextuality with Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale, a play that existed in Germany in Christoph Wieland's prose translation since 1775 and in Dorothea Tieck's verse translation since 1833. The title of the epic signals for the alert German reader to read Heine's Deutschland ein Wintermärchen in light of Shakespeare's Das Wintermärchen. When this comparison is applied, it can be seen that Heine is doing critical work at the formal level. On the surface, the epic seems to be, like many of Heine's works, a comical travelogue. However, at the formal level, the following picture appears. In The Winter's Tale, there are two kingdoms: Sicilia, where the despotic but mad king destroys his court, and Bohemia, where the redeeming character Perdita, the lost child, bides until the time is right for her to return to Sicilia. Perdita is exiled by the despotic king, and her return helps to revive and restore the queen and saves the court from a tragic end. In Heine's epic, there are also two kingdoms: Germany, autocratic and absurd in Heine's depiction, and France, more liberal and tolerant, a place where exiles can bide their time. There is also a lost child who grows up in exile and returns to the home court. Once the parallel structures have been laid out, it becomes clear that Heine is Perdita. The intolerant ruler, both Friedrich Wilhelm IV of Prussia and Metternich of Austria and the German Confederation, are like Leontes. They exiled the radical writers of the Young Germany movement, including Heine. The ruler of France, following the Revolution of 1830, Louis Philippe, tolerates the exiles, including Marx and Heine. Heine had a strong desire to return home and to continue writing and critiquing in his homeland in effort to transform it. And this is what he's working with in Wintermarken. And there's one scene in the Wintermarken that I want to talk about. And this is where he's walking through Hamburg, his hometown, and he sees a woman that he takes to be a prostitute. He's looking for a prostitute for the evening. But instead, what he finds is Harmonia, which she's like the symbol of Hamburg. And she takes him up the stairs to her apartment. And she says to him that he can see the future if he looks over there in that metal pot. And she says, that is a magic pot wherein the magical powers brew. Stick your head in the opening so you will see the future. Well, what Heine sees, of course, is the goddess's shit stewing and stinking in her clothes stool. This is the future of a country bred from power and profit. The smell proves overpowering for the poet, and he falls unconscious. When he comes to, he is in a scene similar to A Midsummer Night's Dream, where Bottom is resting after presumed coitus in the goddess's embrace. However, Heine does not stay with the goddess in the stink of the new capitalist Germany. He returns to Paris, his space for critique, and in real life now, to the table with Karl Marx to write the texts that would critique the new conditions of his homeland. Another thing to say about Heine is that some of the most famous Marxist concepts, for example, the opium of the people, this comes from a Heinrich Heine poem. The verkehrte Welt, the inverted world, this comes from a Heinrich Heine poem. So many of the great images that we know come from Marx originally came from Heinrich Heine. So I'm here on the grounds of the University of Berlin, which is today called Humboldt University. This is the university that Karl Marx attended. First he went to the University of Bonn, and then after 1 year his father sent him here to study jurisprudence. And he also studied philosophy. Specifically, he studied Hegelian philosophy. And it's here that he became radicalized, partly through his critique of Hegel's philosophy. And what I want to read here is from my first chapter. I don't want to talk about what Marx was thinking. Instead, I want to talk about what Jenny Marx was thinking. So Jenny von Westphalen, later Jenny Marx, was Marx's fiancée. And while Marx was here studying, Jenny was home in Trier. But she was 4 years older than him and had been already studying politics and Latin and Greek and Shakespeare and world literature and Goethe and all of that before Marx. And so, let me read a little bit from my first chapter. There is evidence that Jenny's love for Karl was intertwined with their intellectual and political education. After Karl left for university, where he studied jurisprudence and philosophy, Jenny struggled to keep up with her educational development. In her letter, she indicates that she is also studying Greek and quotes from Virgil's Aeneid in Latin. In an 1841 letter where she writes lines in Latin and Greek, she tells Marx that she reads some articles from about Hegel. In an 1841 letter where she writes lines in Latin and Greek, she tells Marx that she read some articles on Hegel in a newspaper that morning. She complains that working with her hands, knitting and cleaning, is not fulfilling. She wants to learn as Marx is. One can imagine her frustration. When Marx entered into the tutelage of Jenny's father, Jenny had already been there for at least 4 years. She may have already known a lot about literature and politics, yet it was Karl, not Jenny, who was allowed to go to gymnasium and then to university. Jenny then writes what can be seen as a deep allusion to The Tempest and A Midsummer Night's Dream, which serves as a vehicle to carry her frustration about being left behind intellectually. On 10 August, while under doctor's orders confined to her bed at her parents' house in Trier, Jenny writes to Karl that, "It is quite pitifully empty in my whirring, roaring little head, and it has hardly anything in it but wheels and clapping and mills." In German, this is what she wrote. "Es ist heut gar jammerlich leer in meinen sausenden, brausenden Kopfchen. Und fast ist nichts mehr drin als Räder und Klappern. und Mühlen. The conjunction of wheels, clapping, and mills suggests that she's alluding to a specific image that Karl would recognize. The image can be found in August W. Schlegel's translation of The Tempest, where Prospero reminds Ariel that he freed him from the tree where Sycorax had imprisoned him. And he says, Prospero says in the German translation, Und ließ dich da, wo du gestern ausstießest, unablässig, wo Mühlenräder klappern, and left thee there where thou didst vent thy groans, as fast as mill wheels strike. Jenny made the verb klappern into a noun, and split the Mühlenräder into two nouns, and placed them all in her head to whir and roar. The sound of the wheels and mills is placed parallel to Ariel's groans, which arises from his imprisonment. What is Jenny's imprisonment? It is the limitation on the education of a woman in the mid-19th century German states. Similar to Ariel, who was a free spirit before Sycorax imprisoned him, Jenny was intellectually free as a youth in her father's house. Jenny describes her head as a sausenden, brausenden Kopfchen, a whooshing, roaring little head. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Theseus says that lovers are like lunatics because they have seething brains. Seething connoted boiling in Shakespeare's time, and Schlegel translates this as brausendem Gehirn, a roaring brain. Jenny is in love both with Karl and with learning. She met both in her father's little academy, and while Karl was away, first at gymnasium and then here at University in Berlin, Jenny missed her beloved and missed out on the education that Karl was receiving. Like Ariel, she was trapped. Like the lovers in Dream, she was boiling. The contradiction between her claim that her head is pitifully empty and yet is whooshing and roaring expresses her frustration. And to register that frustration, she produces a deep allusion to Shakespeare. So I'm here in the center of Berlin in a park called the Marx-Engels Forum. And here we have the Denkmal, or the statue to Marx and Engels. This was made in 1986, or completed in 1986, by Ludwig Engelhardt. And then after the Cold War ended, the capitalist West that came in moved it from its central place, which was over there in the center of the park, and then moved it over here to this corner. But it remains here. The memory of Karl Marx remains to remind us of what he wrote, what he struggled for, what he was talking about, and that what he was working with is still with us and so important and needed to be solved. My book is a rereading of his work, and I hope it will situate Marx at the center of the history of Western ideas, especially alongside his precedents in literature, for example, Shakespeare. I want to present this red rose of socialism and my book to the memory of Karl Marx, the man and the revolutionary, but also to present the book to the struggle against capitalism. May it be useful to the class struggle in a fight for a better world.